Catherine Knight Steele. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland, where I also direct the Black Communication and Technology Lab, as well as I am the director of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Studies in the Arts and Humanities. I've been at Maryland for about 8 years, and I came originally there to direct the African American Digital Humanities program, which was a program that merged together African American history and culture and digital humanities studies. So I directed that program for about 3 years, and then went back to my department, my home department, which is communication. Prior to that, I was at Colorado State University before that. And my research broadly looks at race, gender, and media with a specific emphasis on Black discursive practices historically and in socially mediated spaces and digital cultures and environments. I've written a few books, Digital Black Feminism and Doing Black DH with Radical Intentionality, working on projects now around joy and the idea of digitality and joy and the relationship between the two. So the Black Communication and Technology Lab is part of the broader DISCO network. DISCO is short for the Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism Network. So we're a network that founded with originally 6 PIs at 6 different labs around the country, including University of Michigan, Stony Brook, Purdue, now Northwestern, and Georgia Tech University. And each one of our labs focuses on kind of different components of this idea of digitality, speculation, and optimism. My lab, the Black Communication and Technology Lab, focuses on Black scholars and scholarship. And we really put a heavy emphasis on sustaining the next generation of scholars and scholarship at that intersection, which means we do a lot of work around mentoring and collaboration, in addition to things like skill building, helping folks apply for graduate programs, apply for scholarships and fellowships. And within our lab, we also host several research collaborative projects. A current project that our team has been working on over the past year, which includes postdoctoral faculty fellow, graduate students, and undergraduate students, is a digital migrations project. And this started shortly after Elon Musk purchased Twitter, and students and faculty were kind of reeling about how they were going to continue to study the site. A lot of the previous methods that we used relied on what's called Twitter's API. And as that was no longer accessible to scholars, at least for free, people were thinking, what are we going to do? How do we still mine or pull data from Twitter? Well, first of all, we work in our lab on the premise that mining information from marginalized populations might not necessarily be the best approach, or at least the best way to talk about what we're doing. But beyond that, we do still recognize the need for scholars to still have access to what's going on in socially mediated spaces. Further, the question kind of arose, where are people going to go? Are folks who are actually used to spending time on that space, particularly Black users, going to leave Twitter now that there are more instances of hate and harassment, less regulations and policies in place to protect people on the app? And so our postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Rihanna Walcott, started leading this initiative around digital migrations to kind of try to track how people were discussing the potential of leaving Twitter. And as a part of that process, they developed some core collaborative methodologies about how they would scrape Twitter in ethical ways. How would they pull data from Black users, or ostensibly Black users, from Twitter, whilst providing credit and citation to those users for their words and thoughts? How would they cultivate a database of the kind of discussions and discourses that were present there that included things like images and videos and memes that we actually couldn't scrape with some of our previous kind of big data methodologies? They've been working on this project for well over a year now. They're now at the stage of writing down their methods and how they work together collaboratively to do this, how they created interesting data visualization projects based on the information they found there, and now how they can start to actually publicize some of their findings in both academic journals and in other spaces as well. So that's just one example of the kind of collaborative projects that we have going on in the lab. Outside of those kind of more formalized projects around one research area or topic, we also do some pretty regular programming around called BCAT Applies and BCAT Eats, BCAT Learns. In BCAT Learns, we bring in scholars to provide workshops for students and faculty on a variety of topics of interest. In BCAT Applies, which we host about once a month or twice a semester, We focus on different areas, sometimes helping graduate students prepare their CVs to go on the market, sometimes providing undergraduate students a way to see professionalization in terms of what kinds of jobs and careers they might pursue at those intersections, just trying to help folks kind of move on to the next stage of what they're planning to do with their professional programs. And then we host BCAT Eats once a month, and I think this speaks to your question about values as well. When I ran the AdHum program, or African American Digital Humanities program, we found that some of our best and most fruitful discussions happened over the lunch hour, where oftentimes I would just say, okay, what do folks want to eat? And we'd order a bunch of Jamaican food or Thai food, and we would sit and have conversations that led to planning things like the first major international conference in Black DH called Intentionally Digital, Intentionally Black, or that led to the birth of my second book project, which I wrote with two of my former students who were parts of AdHum. And these conversations really happened over meals, and they happened without the burden or stress of something having to be accomplished, and instead the goal being building community and providing sustenance for the people who actually needed it. So BCAT Eats once a month is just a place where we hold space for anyone on campus who wants to come have dinner with us. We sometimes watch old movies, particularly African American cinema. We play games together like spades or Uno or dominoes, and we just kind of reflect on the day's events and how folks are doing, and we make sure that they have enough food that day and when they go home. I reflect on that quite a bit, that food ways and this kind of notion of care and feeding becomes a really important part of how we run the lab and our kind of ethos for ourselves and for our students, but also how we conduct research itself. And those kind of practices of care seep into how we treat each other, but also how we treat the digital artifacts that we are studying, how we treat the people whose words are part of our research projects. That care can spill out from our meals in the lab into our methodologies and our epistemologies as well. Digital Black Feminism is a kind of years-long project for me. I wrote my dissertation research on the Black blogosphere, and it was called Digital Barbershops. And when I came to the end of writing that book, what I realized was even though I was writing about Black blog communities online that were mostly founded by women, I used the titling barbershop in order to make a signal to people who I thought might be unfamiliar with Black cultural spaces about what kind of environment I was writing about. But the truth was, all along, I was much more interested in what I call the virtual beauty shop. And so that's kind of one of the key signposts in the book for us to think about the long historical trajectory of Black women's relationship with technology. That our relationship with technology doesn't begin in socially mediated spaces, and it doesn't begin from a place of deficit. And so I really write the book in order to rewrite into history Black women as technologists and experts, to redefine what we mean by technology so that we can actually have a truer, more fulsome picture of what it means to have that kind of techno-cultural relationship. So the book traces the principles, praxis, and products of Black women online. I think about this not just beginning at Twitter, but beginning way back before Twitter. I interrogate some of the artifacts and archival materials of Black feminist writers of the 20th century as well. And I pair those kinds of analyses with Black feminist content creators online today to think about what has changed, what's shifted, what has been enlivened by digital culture, and also what possibilities become foreclosed upon because of the relationship between Black feminist thought and digitality. So specifically in the chapter on product, I think about what it means to actually turn Black feminism into a product for sale in a digital environment. What does it mean to have to brand oneself or brand revolutionary thought? Can you actually have a revolution if you have to sell it online?
Right.
And so it's just a lot of questions that I'm posing about the future with the recognition that that book really just traces a moment up to a moment in time, and that our digital landscape is moving so rapidly that I hope people continue to follow up on that and all the changes that have occurred. I often encourage students that, who think I've got to get this piece of writing out quickly because this thing isn't going to be talked about anymore, and something went viral, I have to write about it right now, I have to write about this app right now. And the goal really for communication scholars anyway is to write about the people doing the communicating and what the communication does for us as a society rather than the tool itself.
Yeah.
So even though you think of yourself as writing about Twitter or writing about TikTok, what you're actually writing about is a tool that is being used by a group of people to achieve some ends.
Yeah.
And if you write about it that way, and you think about it historically, you think about the long trajectory of what people need in terms of their sociality and their networked cultures with one another, then that kind of writing is always relevant.
Yes.
We can go back and read writing about the CD player and the Walkman, and we can read writing about the record player and the newspaper, and they still be hyper relevant today because those folks are telling a story about what people were encountering, what it meant to them, how they used that tool, and what they did with it over time, how it changed them and how they changed the tool.
Right.
That's how I think we need to write about social media and technology. In the book, I do a kind of direct comparison between 3 at the time present writers online and 3 Black women writers of the 20th century. And so those folks are, I look at Ida B. Wells Barnett, I think about Anna Julia Cooper and Zora Neale Hurston. All 3 of those Black women are writers, but in very different ways, in very different contexts. Zora Neale Hurston doing folk literature, doing some anthropological work. Ida B. Wells Barnett, a journalist, also a data scientist in many ways. And Anna Julia Cooper, whose academic writing, prose, and rhetoric is still written about today in terms of her arguments toward Black women's rights. And then I think about them comparatively to 3 very different Black women writers online right now. Jamila Lemieux, who was a former editor at several large magazines, has a very extensive publishing career in a professionalized way. Levia Jaye, who began as a blogger and humorist and now is a New York Times bestselling writer. And Feminista Jones, who has written several books, who is a graduate student herself, and who is one of the early thinkers about Black feminist thought on Twitter and in digital spaces and how those things relate to one another. And each one of them approaches the topic of Black feminist thought very differently, has different audiences, even different writing genres and spaces online. And what I try to think about is less whether or not their work qualifies them as feminists. I make the assumption that they are Black feminist thinkers. And I also make the assumption that, to your point, we should document them as such.
Yeah.
That we shouldn't have this dearth of research about the kind of Black feminist thought that's happening online because these writers integrate things like reality TV or Scandal into their writing. Just because they're also writing alongside things like pop culture or discussions about hair or relationships doesn't make their work less valid, less interesting, and less important for how we think about the future of Black feminist thought and its possibilities. So I do a little bit of analyses of each of these 3 women, covering some issues on their use of the idea of capture and of publishing and of threading, and how those kinds of forms of praxis are integrated in all 6 women's work. I'm always of the mind that there is deep, important theoretical work to be done, right? And that theoretical work helps us do other kinds of work. So I never run away from that kind of writing and that kind of publication as necessary and as needed. But I also was felt deeply and strongly that the work that I did, particularly in the book Digital Black Feminism, be readable and accessible to the folks that I was writing about, that I was writing for. And so I try to keep a mindset of the fact that I'm writing about folks, that they should have access to the thing I'm writing in some way. And that's through the kind of language choices that we use, that's through the kind of explanations that we do within text, but it's also through things that you mentioned, podcasting, public talks and lectures, making our work accessible online. So often, even when we do try to write in accessible ways, our work is held behind paywalls for academic journals. Whether or not it's actually allowable, I will send my work to whoever asks for it. I am of the mindset that any student that ever reaches out can have a PDF copy of my book if they want. They can. I didn't write it in order to make money, as many of us know. In academia, our writing doesn't do that. So it's important to me that it is useful to other folks. And whichever ways that I can make my work more useful, I try to engage in that practice. So I visit a lot of classrooms. I'm able to give public talks and lectures and hopefully see my work taken up by other people. I think that's one undervalued way of being a public scholar, is to ensure that your work gets taken up by others readily and easily. Which means that students at a variety of universities can reach out for things like this and interviews, but also can get access to the print publications as they need them.
Right.
There are folks who do this in, I think, much more specific and targeted ways, and I often encourage students, if you want to be a public scholar, it is not something you do in your spare time. It is a skill and a craft that people hone very, very well. I think about Tressie McAdam and the work that she does. I think about Sophia Noble and her public scholarship, Rua Benjamin, Alondra Nelson. There's a cadre of Black women technologists and scholars who really think carefully and intentionally about how to create work that doesn't live in the academy, but instead is accessible to a public. So one piece of advice I always give to graduate students in particular, but I think is very relevant to late stage undergraduates as well, is to never be quite exactly sure what you're doing. Yeah. So much so that you're not open to learning new things. Oftentimes when people apply to graduate programs, they think they have to know exactly what their dissertation project's going to be, what the trajectory of their next 20 years is going to be. Take the class. Go to the lecture that you think isn't relevant to you and see just how many ways you can find synergy with folks who are doing dissimilar things or seemingly dissimilar things across your campus or across your discipline or outside of your discipline. Because those are really the spaces, I think, where interdisciplinarity comes into play, and you're able to make these really wonderful collaborative connections, either with other scholars or with other scholarship that you didn't anticipate or see as something that you might do. The second piece of advice I would give to folks specifically who want to do research on marginalized groups and marginalized populations, and I say this very often, is that you really have to be in it for longer than the research project that you're working on. If you plan to work with a community either that you're a part of or that you're not, in some way you're going to have to develop a sense of love and care for that group of people as human beings, as full and complete humans in some way. It can't simply be a project that you want to publish. It can't simply be a dissertation project that you need to get done or a book project that needs to hurry up and get out. This has to be a long-term commitment to care for those groups. And I'll put just a little plug in, even if you're someone who does things like looking at older documents and historical artifacts and you work in the archive, those artifacts belong to people. Whether or not they're housed at your university or your library, they were someone's papers, they were someone's things. And so that same kind of care that we bring to folks who we see face to face when we do ethnographic work or interviewing work, we can bring to documented work and archival work. We can also bring to digital work. It's very easy for us to become detached from the words or phrases that we see online or the video content that we harvest for our own research projects. I encourage folks as often as possible to see these artifacts as belonging to the people that created them and really working with them as such. We have things in place that help us understand how to work with human subjects. But rather than people being subjects, how do we work with just human beings? How do we see people in the fullness of their personage rather than for the pieces of themselves that they leave behind that we find useful in a given moment?